Okay, it looks like we are running our light bulb fire. Welcome to Evolution Hour on the 19th of January in our ongoing year of doom. And of course, the exciting KotukinWordPress.com pile of PDFs that is available for everybody to have if they want to. They're all freebies. Okie doke. Wait till I get my picture back on. There we are. So, where did I put? As usual, we are slogging through Titans, our cute little dinosaur book by Sarfati and Tay from Creation Ministries International. And this time it's a kind of double whammy week because Sarfati gets a second jab from a post from creation.com, which we'll be getting to. Hello, Lisa. Yes, about almost a half an hour past my starting time, but we were busily doing all sorts of things. Rocks Were There, Volume 2, up the last bits of the cosmology chapter. Cute little thing on the supposed Dyson sphere built around a distant star, which turned out to fizzle very, very quickly. But a couple anti-evolutionists, Danny Faulkner and Michael Egner, weighed in on it in ways that were kind of revealing of their method. And so I was adding a little section in on that and doing background research. This episode is continuing their chapter where they're going through the candidates for intermediates and ancestors and the like. And they hit one that I was awfully fond of, Protoavis, because it's a very interesting case. Don't be surprised if you haven't heard of Protoavis. It was a proposed Triassic bird by Chatterjee back in 1991 to the main paper that Sarfati and Tay are riffing off of. And Sarfati and Tay are painting it entirely as, well, the evolutionists don't like Protoavis in the Triassic because it conflicts with their models of bird dinosaur origins. It puts it back much too early, and so forth and so on. They sort of quote mine their way through a few minor blips. They've even got Ellen Feduccia being quote mined about that it was this would be a problem for the standard bird dinosaur model. What they leave out is most of the background context, which first of all would involve the fact that Feduccia himself didn't think that this Protoavis fossil was a real fossil. It wasn't a legitimate taxon. It was certainly that position in 1999. So what all of this evolves about is, one, it's a very, very problematic Dockham formation, which is a mudstone, and it was a fragmentary mess. It wasn't like a articulated skeleton. And a lot of scientists were very skeptical of it, even though Chatterjee had a very long monograph on it in 1991. Not seen as particularly by the review that Chiappa did in 1995. Unfortunately, I've only got the abstract of that one to put up from Nature magazine. And then there's also various criticisms that people had done over the years. By 2004, which was around the same time I was doing my old tip chapter, EvoWiki had a breakdown of what was the problem about it and why it was controversial and why it was not particularly likely to be an actual fossil. It was just a agglomeration of bits and pieces of Herrerasaurs and some other stuff. It figured in my old tip chapter, which dates from that same period. They wouldn't have to quote mine if they had evidence. That is exactly the point, yes. In fact, there was a latest video from Dave Farina where he was listening to this fellow Fasoli who was just prattling on vomitous amounts of quote mining material, and then brought up apparently an intelligent design advocate, except suddenly hanging up John Sanford's genetic entropy, young Earth creationist. So yeah, wickily wackily, it's kind of weird. So he's going to be actually being mentioned in the new book because of the people who wrongfully bring up genetic entropy as a thing and how it filters around through a lot of the little nooks and crannies of creationism. But I digress, as usual. I'll be putting a link up to my old chapter on the fossil record and bird origins from TIP, the PDF detail that I'm going to be doing on this show. Great. All the little fun and bits about it. But about it, from my perspective, and the reason why I was interested in it back in 2004, is because it was really, the Protoavis was in creationist circles. Duane Gish was about it. He repeatedly plowed into it, and I did all of that in the old TIP chapter. Hank Hanegraaff riffs off of Duane Gish, and so this filtered around the edges of stuff. Was intriguing that Sarfati and Tay make no mention of the fact that there was any creationist jumping the gun on this. In fact, for all practical purposes, Sarfati and Tay don't pay any attention to any creationists outside of CMI. They're not alluding to Henry Morris at ICR. They're not alluding to Duane Gish. These things are the old guard of 20th century creationism are as if they didn't exist. And Sarfati and Tay are kind of trying to straitjacket all of their argument into their little frame so that you're just seeing it from their little teeny slice. But I was aware of it being a much bigger subject. Sarfati and Tay pop up. Sarfati pop up this quite recent, last year, now that we're into 2026, on the collagen issue. This relates to soft tissue stuff, and he's insisting that iron fails to preserve collagen. So he's doubling down on this claim that is kind of essential for creationists to make use of in order to keep the implications of the soft tissue stuff as not necessarily meaning that it can't be made millions of years old. And so they're roughing off of a paper from 2020 from Ullman. I'll be putting a full link up to, where they were experimentally exploring the impact of iron on collagen. It wasn't really about experiments, the impact of if you dip a bone in various levels, how much of it's leaking into the outer surface. I mean, it's not irrelevant to the preservation issue. It's just not salient as to what can in the material deep down inside of the bone, which could allow teeny tiny little bits and fragments of bone to preserve collagen, which is a hardy molecule to begin with, over long periods of time. So that is going to be a funky little paper. You can compare the Ullman work with what Sarfati tried to do with it. And it's we're devoting a quite long section in Rocks 2 on the whole soft tissue thing. It's almost ubiquitous in current creationism, and it has soft tissue. And it's a field that has become its own subcategory for Joel Duff, where he's talking about the hemoglobin challenge. Any creationist that makes the mistake of saying that there were that were preserved in any of these tissues, because nope. And so it's a fascinating example about the cherry picking. The whole phenomenon is an example. Tropes that are quite a ways back in the field. They're not keeping up with the current literature. Mary Schweitzer herself contributed a lot of papers that have helped explain all this, including a 2014, not exactly news bulletin stuff, over a decade ago, about the role that iron plays in this. And it's just a matter of chemistry. So it's an intriguing case. Fossils like that require very special conditions, exactly. And one of the things that struck me way back at the time that I was doing my old, original TIP work back 20 years ago was the fact that the idea that there were ubiquitous fossil graveyards. That was a trope that goes all the way back to the Duane Gish era. Connect the dots on that, call back on that. The Henry Morse, Duane Gish era were really playing up the idea that the flood was represented by these fantastically massive deposits of bone beds all lumped together and so forth. Well, as anybody who's familiar with paleontology ought to know, those are unbelievably rare. And speaking, are the more spectacular. So some of these bone beds are roughly the size of my house here. Other areas would be relatively small areas, rock quarry maybe, which was a lake. Very, very distinctive conditions. And that brought Lager with our low deposit, but a whole big slosh had happened, mushed up together everything that's been alive, at least within a fairly close region. And remember, sloshing around globally, moving continents around. I mean, it's just, it's a spectacular, on the say how incredibly disastrous the flood was and how cataclysmic. And on the other, somehow it never caused like a whale fossil to mingle in with a mosasaur or an Archaeopteryx or that to get in the deposit as a condor or a pterosaur. That never happens. And it's because they weren't all happening at once. So the absence of these bone bed super duper fossil graveyard things, that they are so rare that they pop the champagne paleontologically to be able to see these things involve very, very specific conditions. You can have local, lots of organisms together, organisms all the time. Things don't typically form fossilization. Of it do that, but organisms get buried without having to have a flood. Is a real in my old tip work, my favorite example, frankly, highly indicative that ran aground in the Mississippi River back, I think, east somewhere around in there, and some are located. Paleontologists, they were able to isolate the Mississippi River. Moved. It was very, very mobile. The Army Corps engineer keep the river moving. Frankly, the wreck of this was, and an excavation on, I think, about 100 feet away from the riverbank, underneath like 40, and they had to dig down into it. And it was beautiful, relatively beautiful condition of what was left over before it got buried. But this can happen all without catastrophic circumstance. Catastrophic events, however, are quite a different kettle of fish, because they can't possibly produce certain platen calcs, which example of the Solnhofen, where the Archaeopteryx is. That's a funky little. There's so many of these terms that are German, like Lagerkalk, because so many of the people that did them were Germans. So they were terminology that came up. The same reason that Gish, the KT extinction, K, it's the German pronunciation of that. Plattenkalk. I think this is the spelling here. And I don't think there's an umlaut or anything in there. But plattenkalks, we alluded to them in Rocks Volume 1. And they are a useful area. Same same way that airborne volcanic ash is a critical item. I've been keeping my eyeball peeled for anything in that area, and I recommend anybody that wants to contest creationist accounts of flood geology, be aware of airborne volcanic ash in paleontological work, geology. It can be often easy. More, maybe more of these examples aren't about explicitly volcanic eruptions. They're about a completely different context. But along the way, when you're looking at the stratigraphy list, listing off all the different strata that are involved, you'll often see these things: airborne volcanic ash layers. Of course, they love that because they can radiometrically date those sorts of things. So there are things that were papers that are not explicitly about organisms that die of a pyroclastic flow. They're just in a deposit that was quite gradual because of miscellaneous drop dead next to a riverbank, and getting covered over with a little slosh of mud, eventually. Bits and pieces, incomplete carcasses, etc. But it's sandwiched in between volcanic deposits. You have a volcanic deposit in the tranquil pre-flood world or in the flood world. You can imagine it in the decayed, sin world post-flood. That kind of thing seems to be okay. They can have volcanic eruptions and messes there. But creationists typically have Eden being time. In fact, some of the creationist lore argue that earthquakes are becoming more frequent. They're not. All sorts of that stuff. It's a fun example. They're a fun word that everyone should be remembering. How things die. And I should have an OMI there. It's a whole discipline where it's not that nothing ever gets done on taphonomy in the creationist literature, but as Jackson Wheat has pointed out, he just alluded to, for all practical purposes, creationists like thinking, because they would have to dive into the detail why the bit pieces and the circumstances of where those pieces are found fit in any way whatsoever a big slosh scenario. It's just not a thing. So anyway, we've got, I'm really jonesing to finish up this stupid cosmology chapter. It's been a big thing to bite off. But of course, the universe is a big thing. And to exactly how much creationists are leaving out meant really foraging through a mass of the creationist literature, old material that the average contemporary creationist is not going to be noticed. There's an amazing amount of bearing their own history in this matter. It involves goalpost moving on things. Danny Faulkner is probably the great goalpost mover here, because he's been effectively telling fellow creationists they should be accepting a hell of a lot of things as just facts of nature that need somehow to be accounted for in their young earth creationist cosmology. And he's also well aware of the fact that absolutely none of the models put forward by any of his fellow creationists work. So it's all goalpost moving. And there's an awful lot of promissory notes. Oh, we should start studying a thing, and then they don't do anything on it. Or this is a great promising area that we need to give explanation for. And then you jump ahead another decade or more, and there's nothing on it. And this is popping up over and over again in the literature. Then the other things, of course, are things where they're kind of trying to play gotcha by bringing up a particular topic, and then they drop it, and they move on to another rock. And there's been an awful lot of evolution of creationist apologetics, which, if you only looked at a teeny slice, and especially if you only looked at a slice within one of the little groups, so if you only looked at it from CMI's point of view, or AIG's view, or ICR's point of view, you wouldn't realize the broad range of confusion that's going on in cosmological fields. Fortunately, there was a clear example, again, with Danny Faulkner, where he had a chat, 2019, 2021, somewhere, it's in my notes, where he's basically explaining why every alternative from their side has problems and why nothing is going on. So they're just kind of constantly jumping from one rock to another, largely circulating around the problem of why can we see things that are so far away. And so we're systematizing everything in terms of the 5 or 6 different approaches that are being used. And then, of course, really doing an extensive section on the day 4 problem which won't go away no matter how many quibbles they do about whether they're exoplanets or whether they don't like the Big Bang or whatever else. It's an intractable problem. And that's where you also start dragging in the rash of Ross and the old Earth creationist camp, which, although they're in an extremely niche little zone, they are just as smug in their own way. In fact, I had a little joust with Ross on Twitter. I refuse to call it X. Just a couple days ago, where he kind of weighed in somebody else's conversation, and it has to do with the whole issue of where and when the flood was. And the funky little thing about Ross is he's got this unbelievably vague window. Because he wants the flood to be universal but not global, which is a tough thing to pull, which means that he needs to have all the people. I don't really think quite so much about the animals part, but all of humanity is supposed to be in kind of one little zone where a flood can kill off everything except for Noah and the ark. And therefore, everything would still be, after that, Noah's descendants repopulating the planet. And other than vague range of like 90,000 to 40,000 years ago, and not particularly saying where the ark is supposed to be landing and all this kind of stuff, exactly was all of this localized but universal flood supposedly taking place. And I told Ross point blank, holy smokes, guy, there's archaeological data and logical data available sprawling across that, and going back anything that's 90,000 years ago or less is our species. Thank you very much. And to some extent, Neanderthals. So pick a spot, research it. It'll be try to see you do it. And, well, there's a window as the radiometric dating thing where you can't date insert. What is you bring you can date a thing on the bottom, but you still, it doesn't matter. Even if you've got the general notion of chronology, details of the and would be instructive. You dive into this kind of area. I've read enough of Ross's other work to realize how gobsmacked is bringing up some of these contentious stuff in the cosmological department, in Rocks 2 and in cosmology. Tends to be one of those whose website weighs on a wriggle or problem from an old Earth creationist idea that you can take the Genesis days and map them into the big picture chronology and not have to shuffle anything around. And several, not a huge number, but half a dozen, less than people have given a whack at this. And they all come up with complete calibration systems because they can't make it work. Wherever you pull things down, you're going to be finding critters that don't match up with what supposedly is happening on the creation days. And of course, then they have to use the grand rationalization about the sun and the moon and the stars on day 4. The dodge that's been running around since came up with it back in the 1850s, and it's filtered down to the current bunch, of which Ross is just the iteration that the sun and the moon and the stars were made billions of years ago, but you couldn't see them on Earth until the atmosphere cleared. And so they have to imagine this kind of fogscape that prevented that. Well, since there were no human beings around to see it, in fact, for long stretches of time, even by Ross's own chronology, you would have had things that didn't even have eyeballs to see these things. It's a just tendentious piece of rationalization, which charming if writing in 1890, like one apologist route was doing, but it's just hilariously inept to see somebody in the 21st century trying that same shtick. So it will be frankly, probably more bumping into scriptural visions in the cosmology chapter, because creationists have to bring them up to try to buttress their little arguments. And particularly, another little side issue is trying to wriggle around the issue of whether or not little chronology, the bibliology, was flat Earth. Oh, smokes. Younger creationists had the same problem. Though the Earth is not flat, more uproarious than to see Kent Hovind or Ken Ham complaining about, I think Jason Lyle has done that too, to castigate flat earthers for their bad method, when hilariously they're doing exactly the same thing. But since they well know that the Earth is not flat, they can't allow the biblical chronology. They're in a box on this. And so all they have to do then is to try to figure out how to wriggle around it. But the problem is there's the history to contend with. And the same thing goes for the windows of heaven and the notion of what firmament was. It's that the people who are trying to argue that, well, the ancients didn't really believe, the Bible people didn't really believe there was like boom up there. Oh, they did. and all the scholarly literature on what people were actually writing about is out there, not easily found, but still out there. And what's intriguing is how getting cited by the people trying to argue that the biblical chronology wasn't this way. It's just tendentious is all out and superficial, frankly. Anyway, we'll be filling in all those little stops along the way. Lobby doors of heaven, where the little planets are moving through little holes and all that. And you think of the old phrase about the seventh heaven, really so. The chronology in relation to the Talmudic literature. Christians kind of were blopping around the periphery, although you see aspects of it coming up in medieval and Renaissance stuff. Anyway, being that this involves blatant historical revisionism on the parts of, that's my turf, is history. I have particular relish in pointing to those little elements in the chapter. So it's going to be enough. That will be fresh, and once I can get that off the thing, local astronomy, I'll be sending chapter 2 to have it vet any technical issues, and to get back to Jackson's next chapter that he's finished, that he's been, I'm sure, chomping at the for me to put my input into that, to get that out of the way. And then there's a couple more chapters from his direction, including particularly the human evolution chapter, and then my thing where I'll be putting the lead on the another scoop for the book down of Genesis Ark and list, and exactly why it's a pile of crap. Best they can do, whittling things down to as few as possible. So it's opera kind level by leaving out everything that won't fit, and running at base assembly level. But that means they've got to be very tendentious about how they try to draw the line as to what was in a kind and what wasn't. And several people, Erica from some directions, Dapper Dino from others, people who have spotted all sorts of eccentricities, and the fact that the Arctur has slipped in evolutionary ancestors for some of their kinds, in the case of giraffes and horses, definitely. Exactly the things that Duane Gish era creationism would have called heretical and wrong. And the fact that huge swaths of the internal listing are all done in evolutionary order. They've just taken the stuff out of like systematics taxonomy that evolutionists do as to what order, grouping the kinds in the sequences that you would find in a cladistic analysis. It's a dead giveaway that they're running off of that, because in principle, since all kinds are unique, no kind is ever related to any other kind. Why even group them by groups of mammals and birds? Why not just list them alphabetically? Even they kind of follow the structure that people want to see the dinosaurs together and the birds together and the mammal-like reptiles. They've even got a little subsection on that. And then, of course, the other funky thing is that by their own reckoning, 54% of the critters, kinds that went on board the ark, go extinct afterwards. The whole point of the ark was to preserve the kinds. So this was piss poor failure to begin with, but when you're including all of those extinct forms, you're going to find out they outnumber the current ones if you go by family. So there you go. Such is life. So let me put in a thank you note for our people who have stuck with us through the thickened times relating to our patronage. And I fully recognize how dicey the times are. So everybody who's been able to help along in here, Ian, Chen, Paula G, and the others who continued to stick it out all this time. Even as clunky as my stuff is, I'm not fancy schmancy. I don't have a fancy platform. I'm not using green screen behind me. I'm not putting in visuals and the like. But in this respect, I'm clunky, stupid, bad compared to the really sophisticated stuff with Erica's analysis or Dan Stern Cardinale putting up his spreadsheets. Although theoretically I could do a bloody PowerPoint, but it's I'm still in talking head mode here. If we want the details, we get the books. That's where we cover everything in full out detail. So filled some time there on that. We're out to about a half an hour. We'll be continuing in this bird evolution mode for quite a while. Next installment's going to be on Microraptor, which is an intriguing little critter, all in its own regard. And then some of these other systematic stuff on there where they're just skating around the edges. They're tiptoeing so bad, and they're so bloody behind the curve on a lot of this stuff. Even though they're going to be adding some more technical literature here, they're still well behind their creationist echo chamber. The biggest block of stuff in the book is simply citing young Earth creationist material almost exclusively from CMI. So it's very, very narrow, insular echo chamber stuff. And of the technical literature that they've done, they're still running at about a 70% representation state. I put it, by the way, Chatterjee paper is one that I don't accuse them of misrepresenting. They point out this was his paper on Protoavis, and that's quite correct. So even though it didn't pan out, nonetheless, they weren't necessarily misrepresenting the content. Anyhow, let us put advert for volume 1 up here. Waiting for a file to come up. There we go. Come on. Here we are. And then navigate around through my little clinky clunks here to get the window up and get the show on the road. And as usual, thank wonderful Peter for doing this little advert. We'll have a new model for Rocks with Air volume when we get that out of the way. And that's that little puppy. Also tonight, in fact, one of the reasons I was a little bit late today, finishing off watching the first part of Erica's breakdown of Peter Line's interview on trying to dismiss human evolution of fossils. And of course, I could spot a bunch of little eccentricities in his material, but nothing like somebody whose field is anatomy and ape evolution to be able to spot things And apparently there's going to be a second installment, probably in the next week or two, where she's going into the Homo habilis and how Line is wandering his way around stuff. Of course, from a methods point of view, the intriguing thing that really got Erica fascinated was the fact that Line was effectively throwing in the towel and accepting that Australopithecines were bipedal. And then he tries to downplay that. And ironically, then, Standing for Truth, Donnie Budinsky, now parasitically follows that argument. So I guess he follows CMI, la-di-da. But that doesn't stop them making other mistakes or relying on old material. The various technical papers that Erica alluded to, I already had in my reference bibliography. I've started already sorting my end of the human evolution research field, where we'll be able to keep all of our little ducks in a row, range from deep roots of primates all the way through to stuff on cognitive literature and brain research, of which the vast majority of this stuff is not on the creationist scope. They pay no attention to it. And the human evolution area, as salient as it is for creationists, because if there's one thing that has been obsessive about creationists from the get-go, it's we're super duper special, had to be created, and they're going to go at it no matter what. Philip Johnson's Darwin on Trial was an example of that. The longest section in the book was on human evolution. And for those who want to wade through my old tip work on that at the website, I delved into an awful lot of Johnson and others' misrepresentations on this point. I kind of look back on the stuff that I was doing 20 years ago in terms of writing, that we've moved on a lot in terms of how we present material. I think one of the neat innovations that we came up with for Rocks 1 was an idea that I had seen from another book, which was the idea of these info boxes that isolated to where you could have topical material that's really bigger than a footnote, but large enough for an appendix, so that it would order material together and not break up the flow of the remaining text. And the only thing I have to make sure of on the second thing, because it never dawned on me, because the adaptations shift from the print version to the electronic ebook version, is that we have to have two separate versions for both of those. To get all the info box material has to be lumped together rather than the kinds of stuff that's split up and printed on subsequent pages. And so that's broken up all that. And I didn't realize that when we did the first book. My bad. But remember, I'm an old fart for the 20th century. Good God, I come from a time when I had members and so it's cut me some slack. Anyway, everybody stay super duper safe. Weather here in Spokane is kind of mild, which I'm happy to do. I'll get my oil reserves going a little bit longer, but there are terrible snowstorms and ick going on in a lot of areas. And of course, we've got the moral snowstorm blizzard of ice around and burying people and acting like general jerks. If we have our republic in another 5, 10, 15 years, it wouldn't surprise me that an awful lot of these people in ICE are going to be running afoul of one of the positive avalanche of defamation and rights violation lawsuits. And, you live by litigation, you die by it. And an awful lot of the people in the Trump administration that have been trying to be vindictive because the emperor has told them to do so and go after people, not only will these things not go anywhere, but they'll probably lose their license in the same way Rudy Giuliani has and these other people have. So it's the only hope that they could have would be Donald Trump pardoning them. Clearly, if you can roll enough money, you can get a pardon from it. You can be a drug runner, you can get a pardon. You can be all sorts of things if you can be a pardon. But if you're woke or not a worshiper of the golden plated calf, then nope, no pardon for you, kids, no matter how much. Anyway, that's the world we live in. Don't blame me. I voted for Harris. It's not my doing. I'm just watching the sidelines. The Trumptanic steers us into the field. And 2026 election year, assuming we can still have them, out whether or not some Marco Rubio can talk Trump out of Trump. Will this break up NATO? There's just so many things that are just running amok, plus all of these rich oligarchs. And Trump signed Truth Social signed a deal company, although with Trump's track record on business failures, that means they're not going to work very well. All the poor idiots that shelled out $500 for Trump's golden cell phones, they never delivered them. Very Trump, very Trump. And whether or not in the long term there's going to be an awful lot of people with an awful lot of lawsuits, and that these people in the Trump administration drown. There was an old term in Chancery that comes from Dickens' era, and it also figures in the Palliser novels and others about yipes, Forsyth Saga, about people that were embroiled in the interminable lawsuits that occurred in Britain. That can happen here, highly litigious times back, 150 years ago. And Trump reflects that kind of attitude because he's always used lawyers as a way of insulating himself from responsibility and delay, and then settle out of court and pay a fine and then move on and do more cheating. But that can also lead to messes. We've seen bits and pieces of that, although this doesn't necessarily translate into anybody getting any money. I mean, Alex Jones is still shooting his mouth off, even though he was saddled with a colossal fine for defaming the Sandy Hook victims. I don't know that he's ever paid a dime on the thing, which if not, then it's just a deadbeat, a loudmouth platform deadbeat. Maybe in the coming depression times, where suddenly an awful lot of people that were influencers cannot be sustained in an economy where you really have to scrape to get around, that a lot of these people may go the way of Duesenbergs, as I pointed out in previous episodes. So keep that analogy in mind. So anyway, I prattled on for another 10 minutes in here. I'm uncertain as to what's going to be happening. And I'm not completely optimistic, and I'm not completely pessimistic. I'm just uncertain, because we've seen that since Trump thrives on chaos of his own making and has surrounded himself with corrupt, arrogant ignoramuses who have imagined themselves the most upright people in the world, even as they are flushing down the toilet everything that even the Republican Party used to stand for. Everything's up for grabs. And it could be a very interesting time ahead, and the goal for every who has some shred of dignity and intends the round when we need to pick up the pieces and put Humpty Dumpty back together again better than before, so that we don't make these mistakes again. Stay hunkered down. Keep an eye out for the wooden penguins. They're on the march. So we will see you all next week. This next week will be a Luskin list where, surprise, surprise, don't expect any smoking guns of junk DNA being functional. It's an interesting matter to document everything. So everybody stay safe, and we will see you all next week.